Well, first I want to thank the Interfaith organization for inviting me out here today and putting this together. I think this is a great opportunity to talk about a political scientist. So I think I was invited here basically not for my religious credentials, but basically because of I'm in political science. And as a political scientist, I could talk and relate a little bit to Samuel Huntington. And the first thing I'd like to say is that as a political scientist, everything is subjective. Everything we look at is mostly subjective. It's very hard to pinpoint exactly what is objectivity we can objectively study. So, you know, my students keep asking me too, they say, what is a political scientist? Somebody like Huntington or something like that. And I say, well, a political scientist is somebody who desperately wanted to become an economist, but our math wasn't good enough. But Samuel Huntington, we need to, this whole idea, this talk, it made me pull out the article again, read it, look it over. He's a great straw man. We see him kind of this class of civilizations. But we need to put Huntington and the class of civilizations in context. The context of political science and the context of when he wrote it and who he was writing it to. And that also includes level of analysis. That is looking at the internet, this regional ideological blocks, then countries, relations between countries, and relations within countries, and then individuals. And if we can look at it in those contexts, then I think we can also get at that question, what could be done? And that was already, Professor Macchio kind of brought that up as well, and our other very good speaker, and I thought that was very helpful in kind of putting it in context as well. So Huntington, first thing I want to say, believe it or not, he's one smart guy. He wrote literally probably the most important comparativist of our time. And again, I think what went wrong is when he went from comparative politics at internally within a nation relations to international relations, and that was a shift. But he wrote a book called Political Order and Changing Societies in 1968, and he talked about a very important idea of the conflict and problems within a country. When a country modernizes, when you have political culture within new institutions, how democracy does not just come out of nowhere, out of a developing country. It has to develop through decisions by leaders on the ground and institutions developing. It was a very important book, and I think it was a very good book that kind of talked about the problems within a nation and how hard it is to become a solid nation, let alone an ideological bloc. Second, he wrote a book called The Third Wave of Democratization. Again, very important book in 1991. And this was a book that kind of laid the foundation of how we look at whether countries become democracies or not. And again, within a country, not between countries. He was looking at, and he even talked about Islam and ethnicity and religious cleavages and social cleavages within countries. And that was very important. Now, in 1993, he writes A Clash of Civilizations. And then this book, you know, he's talking about this idea of moving from comparative politics, which is a level of analysis within a country, to relations between countries, moreover, relations between ideologies. And this idea of Western, Islamic, Sinic, which I guess is Confucian, Orthodox, Russian, Hindu, Latin America, Africa, and then Japan gets its own little civilization because it's an island in and of itself. Maybe it's because it's such a homogeneous society, he just decided to say, that's a civilization. So here we've got this idea of these blocks. Now, why did he write that? In what context was he thinking about? Well, think about the end of the Soviet Union. Francis Fukuyama writes a book, and he says, or it's a very important article, and it's called The End of History. The end of the Cold War is the end of history. The US won, democracy rules, no more ideologies. So Huntington was reacting to Fukuyama. He was saying, no, ideologies do matter. And so he wrote this Class of Civilizations in 1993, coming out of Foreign Affairs. Makes a big splash. Then it makes such a big splash, he continues the work into a book, which is basically you don't need to read the book, read the article if you haven't read it. So it's the same idea. But the whole idea is we need to put it in context. He was reacting to Francis Fukuyama, who said ideology doesn't matter, and he's saying it does. So we look at it, we think about it in levels of analysis. Then so he went from a nation, within nations, skipped international relations, which is relations between countries, and goes straight to relations between ideological blocs within the whole world. And so the reaction to him is people start saying, you can't look at that level of analysis. You need to look at within countries and even go below. In fact, we can use Huntington in 1968 to criticize Huntington in 1993. Very easy to use Huntington to criticize Huntington. It's a fun exercise in political science work if you want to do that. And it's very easy to do. It's right there at your fingertips. So again, that's pretty interesting when we put them into context. Another great critic, a very important critic, was Amartya Sen, Nobel Peace Prize winning economist. And he wrote, "Identity and Violence, the Illusion of Destiny." And it was a clear critique of Huntington. And again, like Professor Mack was talking about the idea of the individual. And he was moving the individual local identities, not cross-national identities. What is the hierarchy of identities? Who do we identify with? This also reminds me of one of my favorite philosophers, Eric Hoffer. If you haven't heard of him, he wrote an incredible book called True Believer. And I teach in my classes that students, when they think about terrorism, whether it's American terrorists like Timothy McVeigh, or an international or Islamic or Christian or whatever terrorists we're looking at, we need to think and separate them from the religion and the group they say they represent. It is actually more, if we can break it down to the individual, some self-renunciation, the individual who was manipulated by political entrepreneurs. Political entrepreneurs who manipulate religious texts for their own individual or group gains. And here we need to disentangle, and that's a term I'd like to kind of have you walk away with, disentangle the religion and the text, the religious text, from the individual acts. And again, Eric Hoffer is a great, the book True Believer really does, I think, connect that and disentangles the individual act from the text or what they claim to be. The other is, when we think about this level of analysis, like I said, we think about relations between countries, clash of civilizations, is ideological blocks. Now, what do we do? Where do we go from here, if that's the case? And again, I don't have a clear answer for you, but I can tell you what I observe and what I've seen in my own work. And that is, we need to disentangle, again, what are the actual actions and things that are going on. For example, there was an article about 2 years ago in the New York Times, and it said, Chinese Muslims were fighting Chinese Han. There's a Hui minority in China who are Chinese Muslims. And they have an autonomous region in Xinjiang, which is Xinjiang and autonomous region in Ningxia. But the Hui are Chinese Muslims in Ningxia. And they are a community living next to Han Chinese, which make up 92% of the Chinese population. And the article said, Hui and Han fighting religious battle. And I said, whoa, and I looked at it, and I said, that's exactly where I do my research. I know that area. And it had a very religious tone to it, and it gave you the feel, and they even kind of get that idea of supporting Huntington's notion. So within 2 months, I was back in China doing my field work, and I went to that place where the article was written. I knew the county and I knew the area, and discovered that it was land. It had nothing to do with religion. And in fact, it was a village that had mostly Hui people, and a village that had mostly Han, and as they were expanding and building, they had an overlap of the land issue. And it was land. And other issues we see, water, resources. Look at Nigeria. And again, Nigeria is a classic example. In the New York Times just had an article about 3 weeks ago about Christian and Muslim killings, Islamic communities and Christian communities battling each other. Then we look at it and we say, wait a minute, is it religion or is it regional? Is it north versus south and southeast? Or is it tribal? Tribal identities rather than religious? Or is it resources? We look at the Niger Delta and we see the battles going on there. So again, the real issue of what we do and where do we go from here, I think, is to not, Huntington makes it very simple for it to lay back and say, look, it's ideology. That's got to be it. And it's a nice, simple way of looking at the world. And it's comfortable. But it really takes a lot of work to disentangle what's really happening. Is it resources, religion? Is it regional? Is it tribal? That takes a lot of work. And I think Huntington gave a shortcut to too many people. I think especially policymakers and even some American policymakers. But it is, I think what we have to do is take a step back. What is to be done is to not get comfortable with certain type of explanations and to get our hands wet and get our hands dirty, get our feet, kind of dug in the ground and go on the ground and look and try to disentangle what's really happening. I think that is the best way to go from here when we want to disentangle that. Again, I want to thank everybody for giving me a chance to speak, and rereading Huntington, which I haven't done in a long time. Thank you.